Ready to roll?
Ready to roll.
Okay, let me know when I'm on.
You're on.
Okay, good.
I'm just going to come over here. So, hi everybody. Today we are in the historical room at Bridgewater Public Library.
Hello, everyone.
We're doing something a little different. Everyone loves Dr. Gary Hylander, so we can't miss our time with him. He is speaking exclusively to the Bridgewater Public Library. He is talking about the Civil War and when the anniversary of when General Lee surrendered to General Grant.
He did not want to do that, by the way.
Oh, he didn't want to do that. Well,
no, but he was forced to.
All right. So I just want to point out a couple things in this room. We've got some pictures of some famous battles in the Civil War, but in particular, this photo is of Civil War soldiers right here in Bridgewater. So that's fascinating. We also have some books on the history of the military history of the battles and some photography history. So this room, whenever the library opens to the public, which I do not have a date for that, unfortunately, but when we do, this room is open whenever we're open. So anyone can come into this room anytime. So I wanted to make sure you are aware of that. But we're super excited to have Dr. Gary Hylander here today. And
I'm here and you're here.
So what else do you need? So
the 50 people that are here are terrific.
all these
How did you
people.
squeeze them in here?
Right. So I'm not going to talk anymore, and we're going to take it away.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
And hello, everyone. And, you know, today's topic, this afternoon's topic, is Lee and Grant at Appomattox. And by the way, that's a tough word to get your tongue around. I remember I had one student who pronounced it Appomattox. I thought I was going to pass out. Appomattox, it's Appomattox. So I stopped the class right there, and I said, everyone after me say Appomattox, Appomattox, Appomattox. And then I said, okay, each individual, Appomattox, Appomattox. It's like one time I was passing by. I do some observing for BU, and at one time for Framingham State, and I heard drift out of the door that Mao Zedong was pronounced Mao Zedong. And I had to stop and poke my head in, and I said, it is not Mao, it is Mao. So everybody learned their lesson there, and I said, would you please repeat it after me? It's Mao, not Mayo. Mayo's on your sandwich. So as I said a moment ago, you know, we're going to do the end of the war between the states, or the Civil War, and it ended in April of 1865, or at least in the East. Now, I know, there was some scattered fighting in the West, but effectively with Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox. And I'd like to frame that. And we need to frame, you know, the war between the states, or the war of northern aggression, depending on what part of the country you live in. I'd like to frame it initially. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning of our conversation this afternoon is to go to the Constitution. And I've mentioned this from time to time, and it's always good to remind folks, listeners, those that are here, and thank you for coming, Rose. I don't know how you squeezed all these people in here, but hello and hello. In 1861, you know, with the election of Lincoln, you know, we have 15 slave states in the country, and with the election of Lincoln, finally 7 of them withdrew from the Union. It was called, I use the word Union deliberately, it was called the CSession. And they made the point, those who seceded and formed the Confederate States of America with its president, Jefferson Davis. And by the way, the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, there were 2. The first one, 2 constitutions of the Confederate States of America. The first Constitution made it clear that if you join the Confederacy, that you cannot withdraw. There was no secession. Interesting, isn't it? And they made a point, the Confederate leadership made a point, and it was true, it was correct, that there was no language here that prohibited a state from leaving the United States of America. You know, it was a union, it was a compact, and if one joins, one can leave. It's like joining the Elks or something. And Lincoln didn't buy that. And Lincoln said the reason that there's no language here which prohibits leaving is that when the framers wrote the Constitution and signed off on it in 1787, 1788, they never thought anyone would want to leave. Who would want to leave such a good deal? And as Lincoln pointed out, and he was correct here as well, as both sides were, you can argue both sides of a case. That's why you have attorneys representing both sides. That Lincoln made the point. Indeed, there is no language here which prohibits leaving, secession. And why? Because the framers never believed that anyone would want to leave. What a good deal we have here. A more perfect union of we the people. I know I reversed that. And Lincoln said, but there is language here that allows states to join. That Lincoln saw the United States as expanding, not contracting. And there's language here that allows states to join the Union or territories to join the Union without any waiting period. That when you join, you are, as Nebraska joins or Wisconsin, you are as equal as the first states to form the United States of America, Massachusetts and Virginia. So that became a point of argumentation. 7 states are out, 6 states are out, and Lincoln said you can't do this. And in that first inaugural, Lincoln made it clear that I don't even hear that you've left, and you're welcome back, and get home quickly. I'm not going to ask where you've been, who you've been with. Get home quickly, and it'll be as if nothing has happened here. Well, as we know, that did not happen. And the war begins, and the War of Northern Aggression, or the war between the states, or however you want to phrase it, that it began in July of 1861. Now, I just want to pause for a moment and interrupt myself. Not just yet. I'm going to interrupt my interruption. That's me, you know that. That there would be one battle. There would be one battle, and I would solve the question as to whether or not secession was lawful, whether or not it would stand, or the Union would be rejoined. I want to mention a couple of things to you. One is this, a film, I didn't bring it with me, but there's a terrific film, if you're patient, and your hearing is good. It's called Pharaohs Army, and Lincoln is Pharaoh. And we don't see Lincoln, but what this film does, it brings the war down to the grassroots level. I'm not going to be a spoiler here, but if you're looking for something to watch, pay attention. It's all dialogue, and you have to hike your chair up closely, or maybe stick a piece in your ear. It's all dialogue, and it brings the war down to the grassroots level. It's terrific. It shows the tension, and it doesn't end well. Many films do not end well, but if you're looking for something to do over the weekend, Pharaohs Army. You can probably buy it for $2. The other thing is, I want to recommend to you a series of short stories by Ambrose Bierce. Now, this is the abridged edition, and these short stories are full, and he participated in the war between the states, and he writes from experience, from observation, from pain. These short stories are full of irony, and the one that I always assign to my students, and the title is Killed at Resaca. Now, Resaca was a small battlefield in Georgia. In fact, Resaca was the host at the first Confederate cemetery. And Killed at Resaca is so ironic. And you can read it. You can read it at a red light, and you'll get the irony here. Killed at Resaca. I shall not tell the assignment. You'll read it, and we're all grown-ups here. You'll get the irony. So anything by Ambrose Bierce, again, the film, the film Pharaohs Army, and let's get started here. The war begins in July, June, April of 1861, and at Fort Sumter. And many of you maybe have visited Fort Sumter. And everyone believed that would be the only battle of the Civil War. And winners and losers would sort themselves out. Didn't work out that way, did it? The Confederacy won the first battle of Bull Run. There were two. And the first battle of Bull Run was won by the Confederacy. And in fact, a man by the name of Wilmer McLean owned the house at First Battle of Bull Run that Confederates used as their headquarters. And as he said years later, in 1865, and as he remembered for the rest of his life, he would always say, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my parlor." And by that he meant Lee and Grant signed the surrender ceremony, signed the surrender document in his parlor in April of 1865. So the war is on. So another show and tell. I mean, there's so many books on Lincoln, on Davis, on the Civil War, that they would fill a library. I want to recommend one. I could recommend a dozen, but I'm going to recommend two, but I don't want to save this one. This is by Gerald Linderman. You probably can't see it. It's spelled Linderman. Can you see it over there? No, I know you can't. Linderman. Gerald Linderman. And it's called In Battle Courage. It's terrific, and it's all about the hardening of the war, of the attitude of soldiers, both who wore blue and those who wore gray. It's a terrific read, and in this book, and I'm going to come back to this theme, for the North, the generals are soft generals. There's no destruction of property. And I'm thinking of Pope, Burnside, Meade, General McClellan. And as the war progressed, and it became more savage and more destructive, as all wars do, that we have a group that are called the destroyer generals, at least in the North. And this is Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. I'll come back to these topics as we go through this. And you know, those of you who have been with me, that from time to time I can drift. The only difficulty is here is that there'll be no opportunity for all of you to ask questions. So I want to anticipate a few questions. That initially, Meade, McClellan, Burnside, and Pope, it wasn't about destroying property. It wasn't about burning homes. It was about one army tagging with another, make the case, and it's done with it. With the attack on Fort Sumter, it becomes a long war. No one expected this to be a long war. 4 years of bloodshed. And the numbers keep changing. They keep going up as to the numbers of casualties. That the number used to be, 620,000 casualties. Recently, and by recently, I mean the last few years, that the number now has grown to 750. And I even think that's a soft number. And if that 750,000 casualties, if that were superimposed on the United States today, that would be 2 or 3 million. I mean, that's an amazing number. And most of these casualties were not deaths. They were from infection. They were from diseases. They were not battlefield deaths. And a good surgeon, it was amputation. A good surgeon could get a foot off, could get a leg off at the knee in about 7 or 8 seconds. It took about 12 seconds to get a leg off at the hip. And after the war, there were so many men on crutches, so many men on artificial limbs, that for Southern women and Northern women, one needed a whole new definition of male beauty. There's very little digging done at the Confederate battle sites today, but on occasion, when it is permitted, what has been found from time to time, and this isn't just random digging, this is trying to identify where a battlefield hospital may have been, and it's called the limb grave. And when the soldiers, when the surgeons would take the limb off, and by the way, there was very little chloroform, and Lincoln deliberately limited, the amount of chloroform that crossed lines into the Confederacy to make war terrible, to make it painful. and they're called limb pits. And every once in a while, whomever's in charge of the battlefield would allow a little digging here and there if they identify a spot where there was a field hospital. And you dig around carefully, because these are the dead. No disrespect. And you can find shattered limbs and find the bullets that are in the limb pit. And they needed a limb pit. I want you to wince when I tell you this, because when they amputated an arm or a hand or a leg, the pigs would show up, and the pigs would begin to root and eat the severed limbs. So they would dug a limb pit and cover it with lime. So you may run across this, in your reading. As I said, 750,000 casualties, and that is not the final number. In this book, Embattled Courage, they talk about the limb pits, and they also talk about how quickly the surgeons could work, and it was next. There's no effort to preserve a limb. The film Dances with Wolves, which is a terrible film, but many are, the Pharaoh's Army is not. In the film Dances with Wolves, it opens up with an amputation, and I forgot the guy who was in. He's not a very good actor. I could do a better job than he could, But in the opening scene, they're going to take his leg off or his foot off, and he refuses, and he gets up off the surgeon's table and hobbles out on a stump, and that's the beginning of it. And then, as a Northern soldier, he makes his way to the west, to the frontier. And enough about that. So the war is on, and those slave states that had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, they were joined shortly by Virginia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas. So now we're up to 11. And the reason that they joined is they believed that a state had the right to secede. And a word that was used back then is that the federal government could not, and here's the word, I hate doing this, but people do it all the time. You know how you fall into bad habits? So I'm going to sit on my hands. That a state had the right to leave the Union and not be coerced back into the Union. Lincoln was so fearful that Kentucky would leave the Union, that Maryland would as well, both of which were slave states. And as Lincoln always said, I hope that God is on my side. He was not a believer, by the way. I hope that God is on my side, but I cannot lose Kentucky. If we lose Kentucky, we lose the war. And Maryland, the government, the seat of the government was located in Maryland. And if I lose Maryland, I have to move the capital to Pennsylvania, or maybe some other state that is a northern state. So there's so many stories here that weave in and out. I'm working on a 5 or a 6-part course right now as we speak. I was working on it this morning. And you know how I like to shop around my courses. And it's a 5 or a 6-part course, depending on how I detail it. And I'm going to call it the unreported Civil War. Incidents that rarely get mentioned because the war, Gettysburg and so forth, and Fort Donelson over here, which I'll get to, that they dominated the story. So I'm thinking it through now, the unreported Civil War. So now we have the Confederate States of America and Lincoln in that first inaugural. I don't recognize this, I don't hear it, but I'm not going to accept it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to protect federal property. And the war is on. And as Lincoln said in July of 1861, and very laconic, he said, and the war came. No one expected it, and not in its fierceness and its duration. And the war came. Now, where did Lincoln find Grant? And where did Jefferson Davis find Robert E. Lee? So you thought I lost my way, didn't you? We're talking about Lee and Grant at Appomattox, not Appomattox. Appomattox. So say 3 times, Appomattox. Grant had served in the Union Army, and he knew Lee. He knew Lee vaguely from the war with Mexico. And when the Mexican War ended, with an American victory, so to speak, that did Grant drink? You bet he drank. He drank. And now he had nothing to do. And he was posted out in the Pacific Northwest with a group of maybe 20 or 25 soldiers. And did he have a drinking problem? You bet. And he also had a problem with discipline. These soldiers with nothing to do. And if soldiers have nothing to do, they get into mischief. They fight, they gamble, they drink. And Grant, as the commander, fought, gambled, and drank. But when the war broke out, and Lincoln is looking for generals, or that Grant was assigned to the Western Theater, where all the misfits were assigned to as officers. And Lincoln did not expect much from the Western Theater. Grant had failed at everything that he did, and one of the reasons that he got involved with the card playing and so forth is that he missed his family. He missed Julia, and she missed him. Sometimes spouses have nicknames for each other. I can't repeat some of them now on air, but Mrs. Grant always referred to him as Yulee. And so he's up there, he's missing her, he's missing his family, so he's getting himself in trouble. We have a Western theater and an Eastern theater. And here's Fort Donelson. Where did it go? Oh, it's up there. Okay, Fort Donelson is up there. I thought it was on a stand over here. And Lincoln will get his first victories from the West. He's shocked at this. And it will be Grant once he has something to do. And Grant was a very detailed person. And by the way, I'm looking over my shoulder here. Here are the memoirs of Grant. Now, if you have the time and you're taking a long flight to, let's say, China, Mao Zedong's China, that these are well written. Grant was an exceptional writer. He's clear, precise, and to the point. Let me take a little side trip here. After the war, Mark Twain will advise Grant. Mark Twain admired Grant. He's the winner, the hero at Appomattox. And Twain invites Grant to write his memoirs, and he will support him financially and help work out a deal. And Grant said, I have nothing to say. And Twain, you have everything to say. You were one of the hard generals. You were one of the destroyer generals, along with McClellan and Sherman. And he said, I'll fund you. I'll underwrite you. And Grant wrote these memoirs, and they were bestsellers. So just if you're looking for something to do, Grant's memoirs. They're not turgid, they're well written, and that they are to the point. Grant was to the point when he was preparing to move on enemy forces. And Lincoln, who is this guy, Grant? I've never heard of him. And the little that I've heard, he's a drunkard. Graduated second to last in his West Point class, I don't know, something like that. And by the way, so did, well, I'll come back to this. And he sent somebody out there to check up on Grant. Is this guy still drinking? Because I'm hearing good things. He took Fort Donelson, which is right over here. He took Fort Donelson on the Chattanooga, the Cumberland River. He took Fort Donelson, a Confederate fort, and also adding to Grant's successes later on were Shiloh and the first Confederate capital, to follow the Union Army was Chattanooga in Tennessee, and Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. And Lincoln, who is this guy? Nothing is happening in the East, where everyone believed that's where the war would be won or lost, in the East. And nothing's happening here. Who's this guy? Grant. So Lincoln sends somebody out to check out Grant. Is he still a stumbling drunk? And the answer was no. He's a fighter, and more importantly, he does not complain. He doesn't keep asking for more horses, more oats, more soldiers, more cannon. He gets the job done with what he has. This is a guy who's been underrated, and here's a guy we need to keep an eye on. And Lincoln, I'll keep an eye on this guy. In the East, where everybody thought everything, I'm coming to Lee, I haven't lost my way, that nothing is happening in the East. McClellan, George McClellan, was Lincoln's first choice to head up the war in the East. And Lincoln interviewed McClellan, and McClellan he wore the uniform well. Little Mac was his nickname, and he did not want to fight. He loved the Army as it was, and he loved when they cheered him, from their tents. Little Mac, Little Mac, Little Mac. And he interviewed well. I know sometimes if you're interviewing people, they interview well, and he interviewed well, and he told Lincoln, I can do it all, that I can command the East and the Western theaters. I can do it all. Lincoln was impressed. Lincoln had very little military experience. In fact, he had none. He was in the militia in Illinois, and he said, the only thing that attacked me was mosquitoes. So here comes McClellan, a West Point graduate, dressed up like a winner, and telling Lincoln, I can do it all. And then nothing happened. He was one of these soft generals. I don't want to lose. I cherish my Army. I cherish my men. And I don't want to lose any of them. But he was pushed by the press. He was pushed by Lincoln. He was pushed by Secretary of War Stanton. You have to do something. You need to get moving. And McClellan put together a beautiful plan to attack, a wonderful plan, a well thought out plan, but he didn't execute it. It's like you have a lesson plan and you don't execute it. You talk a good game, but you don't make it happen. You don't have the courage. You don't have there's a word for that, but this is a family show. You don't have the courage to make that happen. So McClellan dilly-dallied and finally moved his army down, a large army, by the way, down the Chesapeake, and they landed below. Here's the Chesapeake, landing, if this is Richmond, my fist, landing below Richmond. And for McClellan, if I take Richmond, the war is over with minimal casualties. So he proceeded so carefully up the peninsula, and he got almost into the suburbs of Richmond. For him, if I take the capital, I win my war. So I moved very slowly, and the Confederates were giving ground around Richmond. And then the commander there, General Johnson, there were two General Johnsons here, two Confederate generals named Johnson. He was badly wounded, was knocked off his horse, put out of action for months and months, maybe years, I don't recall. I wasn't there. And the Union Army is closing in on Richmond, and again, McClellan, if I take Richmond, the war is over. Grant's going to have another idea about this. And Davis, he can hear the cannonading. Davis looking down the bench, I need reinforcements. He spots Lee. Now, Lee was from a very aristocratic family. Grant was not. Grant was a poor boy who did well. Lee was a descendant of the Washingtons. And by the way, the plantation, that just popped into my head, the Lee plantation was later on grabbed by the Union forces and used as the first national cemetery. And Arlington is a wonderful place to visit. Wonderful is not the right word. It's a very somber place. It's a place of memory, of honor, of doing one's duty and not complaining and willing to accept consequences. Sometimes there are terrible consequences. So here's Davis. Lee is one of his military advisors. He was an artillery specialist. And imagine this, if you can picture this with me. Here's Davis looking down the bench. Who's replaced Johnson, who's been wounded, shot out of his saddle? I can hear Union artillery. And he looks down the bench, and Lee to the front. Lee to the front. And Lee takes command of what will later on become the Army of Northern Virginia. And it's called the Battle of the 7 Days. And he pushes, he's here, he's here, he's there. Lee is everywhere. Mobile, striking, bold, aggressive. Not afraid to take casualties. Lee bled the Army of Northern Virginia to death, and he knew it. So Lee pushes McClellan all the way back to the peninsula, and McClellan is asking Lincoln for reinforcements. Reinforcements, I've given you everything that you've needed. You've outnumbered the enemy. And Lincoln pulled him back and brought him back north to help, defend Washington, D.C. I don't want to get into all the battles because we'll never get done, when I teach the Civil War, and I've done it, we have an hour together. It's a 15-week course. 6 books. This is one of them. 6 books. And then and what the students do? They pile them up. Now, so that's good. That's an 8-inch snowfall. Start shoveling. And they all groan. Say, start shoveling. Because that's going to be on your mid-year. That's going to be part of your final. And by the way, along with the books, you have a term paper to write. And I know you didn't sign up for that. So you would appreciate when I do this, when I put book on top of book on top of book, and I say, you know what? You're going to have to dig your way through all of these. This is about an 8 or 9-inch snowfall. It always gets a groan. I do it deliberately because I like to be a little of a showman. McClellan is pushed back, and Lee is brought in. And Lee is an aggressive bulldog of a fighter. He bleeds the Army of Northern Virginia to death in the long run in April of 1865. Grant is brought east. Lincoln, who is this guy? Grant is brought east. Lincoln interviews him. And Lincoln likes what he hears. And Grant shows up dressed properly. And Grant tells Lincoln, I accept command of all the Union forces, but I do not want to be a desk general. I want to be in the field with my men at the front so that I can see and I can get my reports coming in. I can write orders. And to the amazement of his officers, that Grant would be standing in the middle of a barrage as if nothing were happening and sit on his horse and write out orders. And all hell is breaking loose around him. Cool, composed, unruffled, unflappable is a word I want to use. And Grant, we are not going to bother with taking Richmond. We are going to destroy Confederate armies. And Lincoln liked what he heard. And he used the word Union again. And he said to Grant, when you are in the field, you are the Union. When you're on the saddle, you are the Union. Just keep me abreast of what's going on. And if you saw the Spielberg film on Lincoln, you'll notice that one of the scenes has Lincoln in several of the scenes have Lincoln in the telegraph office, which is adjacent to the White House. He spent almost as much time in the telegraph office as he did in the White House so he can micromanage the war. Not micromanage Grant or Sheridan or Sherman. Just let me know what's going on. You know, my eyes, my ears are everywhere. When you are in the field, you are the Union. And Grant, with Sheridan, with Sherman, the destroyer generals, we need to make war so terrible that Confederacy will give it up and we can have peace. Make war so terrible, so vicious, so bloody. And Grant orders Sheridan, when you move through the Shenandoah Valley, which for the most part had been, it's a beautiful trip by the way, for the most part had escaped the hard war. Grant tells Sheridan, he tells Sheridan, burn everything. Make it so devastated that if a bird flies over the Shenandoah Valley, it had better bring, he's the preventer, it had better bring its food with it. Leave the people in the Shenandoah Valley so devastated that they will only have their eyes to cry with. But those are different marching orders, aren't they? These are the destroyer generals, Sherman, Sheridan, and Grant. Make war so terrible that they will give it up. Make it so bloody. It became a hard war, embattled courage. It's all here. Grant does his job. Grant does not ask for more soldiers, more cannon, more ammunition. He does the job with what he has. Now, I've used the word Union several times. And Lincoln, beginning with the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln began to substitute the word nation for union, that we are a nation of we the people. And at Gettysburg, he begins to use the word nation. Now, he would slip into the word union from time to time, but for him, union meant a collection of states. We are a nation of union, a nation of hearts and minds. Boy, that thought has been forgotten, hasn't it? You know, that's an editorial comment. And in that Gettysburg Address, and you've heard me say this several times when I mention the battlefield at Gettysburg, that he reminds his audience at Gettysburg that your sons, your brother, your neighbor, your uncle, that he did not lose his life. He gave his life that the nation might live. And you can look at that Gettysburg Address. It's only 272 words. I mean, you can read it in 20 seconds. But he deliberately, your son, your husband, did not lose his life. He gave his life that the nation might live. And those are carefully chosen words. And again, to come back to Grant's reputation, that a few days after the Union victory at Gettysburg, it was a bloody victory. For both sides bled out at Gettysburg. Vicksburg fell to Grant. And that oftentimes, Vicksburg is overshadowed by Gettysburg. Vicksburg, when the fortifications of Vicksburg fell, it opened up the entire Mississippi River to Union forces, where they could land troops on the west side or the east side. It opened up the entire Confederacy to Union soldiers. And again, this was one of the selling points for Lincoln to Grant. And Grant comes east, and he leaves Sherman in charge of the Western Theater. Just keep me abreast of what's going on. And Sherman doesn't want Grant to leave. He's fearful that Grant will be caught up in all the politics of Washington. And Grant said, my commander-in-chief has ordered me to Washington. Sherman didn't want that. Sherman was always fearful of his abilities. And he said, as long as I knew you were here, General Grant, I knew you would come and help me. And Grant said, you're good. You're on your own. You're a fighter. You're a fighter. And the march to Atlanta and the burning of Atlanta is part of that. I want to mention something here. The burning of Atlanta, that gets more attention than what happened when Sherman's armies burned Atlanta. And it's not clear as to whether Sherman built it or burned it, or retreating Confederates set that place on fire with burning bales of cotton. But then Sherman moves to Savannah on the coast. And the mayor or the governor of Savannah declares Savannah an open city. I surrender. And Sherman accepts that surrender. And then he turns north. And this gets very, very little attention. South Carolina is more destroyed, suffers more damage and more deaths than Atlanta and the march from Atlanta to Savannah. And the reason for that is this is Sherman, this is his thinking, Sherman, and he tells his officers, the whole thing started when South Carolina retreated or withdrew from the Union. So we will punish South Carolina. So this will never happen again. The destruction, the burning, the devastation of South Carolina is far more destructive, than that of Atlanta or even North Carolina. Almost the fighting doesn't stop as Sherman's forces move into North Carolina, but it becomes less severe. Lincoln, meanwhile, and Lee, meanwhile, and see what Lee was good. Lee was good. He was probably the best Confederate general. Lee was good at bobbing and weaving and getting out of the way and hoping that the election of 1864, I want to watch my time. I want to leave everybody here some time for questions. I know you've had your hand up. Wait your turn, I'll get to you. I need to get to a special spot. That Lee was good at ducking, bobbing, and weaving, but Grant had overwhelming resources that the Confederacy did not have. The Union blockade, from Texas up to Delaware, was very tight, at least by the end of the war, very tight. Very little it gets out or in, except with Gone with the Wind. Clark Gable is running women's delicate clothing. He's running lipstick, makeup, perfumes, and so forth. That's where the money is. Not in gunpowder, but in women's, I don't know this word, accessories. General Lee and his subordinates, and Jeff Davis, they're looking forward. They're looking forward to a successful outcome in the 1864 election. If we can hold off until the 1864 election, and we can buy time, and the newspapers are reporting that Lincoln will be defeated because there's so much blood. There are so many grieving families, and that McClellan, General McClellan, who had been fired by Lincoln and now nominated by the Democratic Party to be the presidential candidate in 1864, and McClellan is running as a peace candidate. If I'm elected, when I'm elected, I will offer peace terms to the Confederacy to get back into the Union with slavery. And the press was reporting that McClellan is going to win that election in 1864. And for Jeff Davis and the Confederate Congress and the Confederate Cabinet, if we can only hang on through the election, Lincoln will be beaten. Lincoln expects to be beaten. McClellan will be president, and he will offer us peace terms. We just need to hang on, hang on, hang on. Lee knew that. Lee hoped that. Lincoln expected that. And when Lincoln called one of the last cabinet meetings before the election day and is seated around the table, he asks every one of his cabinet members to sign what he called the blank memorandum. He said, just sign it. Don't even read it. Just sign it. Trust me. Just sign it. And they did. And the blank memorandum simply said, I expect to be defeated. And that you promise me when the McClellan teams come in, with his cabinet and with his appointees, that you will work with them, to help settle the country and to help run the country. And that didn't happen. You see, Lincoln got the soldier vote. This is the first time, by the way, that absentee ballots were used. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. The late count coming in. And Lincoln won in the Electoral College 212, might be 221, 221 to 21 for McClellan. So for the Confederates, the war will continue, and it will continue. And Grant, meanwhile, keeps hammering and hammering. Lee bobs and weaves at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at the crater, at St. Petersburg. He's running out of men. He's running out of material. His desertions are incredibly high because these men in the Army, they've been fighting since 1861. They're getting letters from their wives, from their sweethearts. You've done your duty. Please come home. We fear that the blacks will have an uprising. Please come home. Protect us. Protect me. Protect your children. And Lee suffers incredible desertions. His army is withering away. It's just wilting. And he bobs and weaves and bobs and weaves, hoping that something will happen. He'll catch a break somewhere. And he doesn't. Lee is, see, what Lee does is, let's pretend here. This is Richmond. My fist is Richmond. And Grant wants no part of taking Richmond. I want to engage that Confederate army. I want to destroy it. And every time Lee bobs and weaves, I'm with him. I'm on him. I'm a heavyweight prize fighter, and I have unlimited resources, and I'm working the body. I'm hitting him. I'm cutting around the eyes. He's bleeding out. And if I keep it up, he will give it up. And Lee bobs and weaves, and he's hoping that he can link up with the last remaining. I sound like I'm at West Point, don't I? He's hoping that he can link up as he bobs and weaves, and leaving Richmond alone, as he bobs and weaves around to link up with the last remaining Confederate army that has any firepower, and that's Joe Johnson, another Johnson, and to link up with him, and maybe something will happen. But Johnson is bobbing and weaving this way to try to hook up with Lee. Coming up from the Carolinas is Sherman. Sherman's bummers, destroying everything, not so much in North Carolina, to cut off Lee. He has no supplies. He can't go anywhere. Sherman cuts the railroads. He cuts the riverways. He's got no place to go. And Lee has had it. And he offers Grant terms. He asks Grant for terms. And let me read something to you, if I may. Give me a moment. This is a wonderful series. It is aged, but so have I. Bruce Catton. This is worth your reading. Bruce Catton, a 3 or 4 part series out on the end of the war. And this is the last. It's called A Stillness at Appomattox. And we weren't there. The army, Lee's army, was beaten. And he knew it. Share with me. Out from the rebel lines. Plenty of time. Out from the rebel lines came a lone rider, a young officer in a gray uniform, galloping madly, a staff in his hand with a white flag fluttering from the end of it. He rode up to Chamberlain's lines. This is Joshua Chamberlain, who held the line. Joshua Chamberlain from Maine, who held the Union line at Gettysburg, wounded several times. And someone there took him off to see Sheridan. And the firing stopped. And watching the Federals saw the Southerners wheeling their guns back, their cannon, and stacking their muskets as if they expected to fight no more. All up and down the lines, the men blinked at one another, unable to realize that the hour that they had waited for so long was actually at hand. There was a truce, they could see that, and presently the word passed that Grant and Lee were going to meet in the little village that lay between the two lines, Appomattox. And no one could doubt that Lee was going to surrender. It was Palm Sunday, and had all lived to see Easter, and with the guns quieted, it might be easier to comprehend the mystery and the promise of that day, Palm Sunday. Yet, the fact of peace and no more killing and an open road home seems to have been too big to grasp right at the moment. One of Ward's soldiers wrote that the army should have gone wild with joy then and there, and yet, he said, somehow they did not. Later they would frenzy cheering and crying and rejoicing, but not now. Now, for some reason, the men sat on the ground, looked across at the Confederate army, and found themselves feeling as they had never dreamed that moment of victory would make them feel. We sat there and we wept for our brothers. I want to dispel a myth right here. When Grant received word that Lee was making his way to Appomattox to talk about peace terms, Grant got dressed quickly. And he showed up with a dirty uniform on and muddy boots. He always wore a private's uniform. He never wore his rank. He didn't want to get shot at by snipers. Lee showed up splendid. Dress sword, shiny boots, a clean uniform, and he presented his sword to Grant. Grant wanted no part of that. So I want no part of this. And many have argued, and it's not true, that Grant deliberately showed up dirty and unshaven and ruffled because he wanted to embarrass Lee. And that's not Grant. That's not Grant. I want to get here quickly. So the shooting and the dying stopped. And they sat there at a small table, half the size, a quarter of the size. Then he worked out the surrender terms. And Lee said, my men are starving. And Grant said, I will send rations. And I didn't know. Grant said to Lee, I didn't know that your officers brought their own horses. They may keep them. I didn't realize these were their own sidearms. They may keep them. I just asked that the soldiers stack their weapons. The fighting is over. And when the Confederate soldiers marched up and stacked their weapons, Chamberlain was there. And Chamberlain said there'll be no firing. There'll be no shouting. There'll be no saluting. And I want you all to stand at attention and salute our brave brothers. I don't want any cheering. If you know how to salute, this is how you do it. You snap it up like this. If you're a Marine, you bring it up from your thigh. I know this to be true. There was no shouting, no firing of weapons. And Grant said, there's no joy here. This is finally over. And yes, General Lee, rations will be sent. Your soldiers can keep their horses. It's April. It's time to get the planting. It's late, but it's time to get the planting in. And it was over. And Lincoln receiving news that Lee had surrendered. And of course in Washington, D.C., the cheering was incredible. And of course we know that John Wilkes Booth was, planning to, putting his assassination team together. So a stillness at Appomattox. And when Lee comes out on the porch, he stood there. He had his white gloves on, riding gloves. And he stood there and he looked at all these Union soldiers and his tattered remnants of his crew, of his army, and he stood there for a moment, as those who remember. One fist, balled, and it's over. It's over. Many of his officers wanted to disband the army and continue fighting in guerrilla fashion in Virginia, in the area around Appomattox. And Lee said no. Absolutely not. And I want to share with you Lee's last general orders. Very short, to his commanders, and by extension, to the men. These are his last orders, Field Order Number 9, 1865, April 10th, 1865. Headquarters, Army of Northern Virginia. It's a paragraph, but I want to share it with you. It's to the point. After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers. To overwhelming numbers. That is such an important phrase. And resources. I need not tell the survivors of so many hard-fought battles, who remained steadfast to the last, that I have consented to the result from any distrust of them, but feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that could compensate for the loss that would have attended the continuation of the contest, I have determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to the countrymen. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed, and I earnestly pray that a merciful God will extend to you his blessings and protection. With an increasing admiration of your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous consideration of myself, I bid you an affectionate farewell. General Lee, Army of Northern Virginia, I bid you an affectionate farewell. And he goes home. And he rarely traveled, because when he traveled, it would draw enormous crowds. And, are we over? It would draw enormous crowds, and it would inconvenience people. So there you have it. Albeit brief, Grant at Lee at Appomattox. Do we have 3 more minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Wilbur McLean, who must have been a bit of a businessman, made the observation, the war began in my front yard, it ended in my parlor. He had moved to Appomattox because he convinced his wife, it'll never get this far. Well, it did. It wound up in his living room, in his parlor. And he said, everything in this room is for sale. This is history. And it will be Robert Lincoln's son tells him this story. It will be everything's for sale, and it will be Sheridan with a $50 gold piece. I want to buy the table on which the surrender was signed. bought it, carried it outside, and presented it he presented it to, oh gosh, his name ran out of my head. The Little Bighorn, help me. The Little Bighorn, just ran out of my head. Custer. He presented to General Custer. He said to Custer, give this to your wife Elizabeth. And what's she doing with you? You are so ugly and she's so beautiful. But tell her, he was a bachelor by the way, tell her that I admire her because you are the only married officer who led from the front. All my other officers were worried about their family. You led from the front. And you give this to Elizabeth and tell it's for me, Phil Sheridan. And I appreciate the fact that you allowed your husband to, I think the camera's looking at that, to lead from the front. And he did. See, Armstrong was reckless. And the Little Bighorn will do him in. So that's it for this afternoon. And you're all dismissed. There is no homework, but you have potential homework here, if you choose to work at it. So good night, good afternoon, and good luck. I'll see you soon.